They had dug in everywhere, but we flushed them out, inch by inch. That's what I kept telling myself as I crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree, watching my boys move through the green that was the Sierra Madre Mountains. Lieutenant Jack Morrison, 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, 38th Infantry Regiment. 6 months ago, I was teaching high school history in Ohio. Now I was writing it in blood and mud on the largest island in the Philippines. The scale of what we were attempting still boggled my mind. General MacArthur hadn't just promised to return. He'd brought the entire U.S. 6th Army with him, over 200,000 American soldiers tasked with crushing General Yamashita's 275,000-man Shobu group. The Japanicide had turned Luzon into a fortress, and we were going to tear it apart piece by piece. The brass estimated we'd face maybe 150,000 enemy troops directly. They were wrong, dead wrong. My platoon was one small cog in this massive machine, 37 men who'd been through together since we'd landed at Lingayen Gulf back in January. Now it was March 1945, and we were deep in the mountains north of Manila, hunting an enemy that had turned every ridge, every cave, every twisted root system into a killing field. The Japanese 14th Area Army had been preparing these positions for months, and it showed. Sergeant Tommy Kowalski belly crawled up beside me, his Thompson submachine gun cradled in his arms like a baby. Sir Rodriguez found another spider hole about 50 yards ahead. Looks like they've got the whole ridgeline honeycombed. His Chicago accent was barely audible over the constant buzz of insects and the distant thump of artillery. I nodded, studying the terrain through my binoculars. The jungle was so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction, but I knew from bitter experience that the Japanese could see us. They always could. Their positions were invisible until you were right on top of them, and by then it was usually too late. We'd learned to read the signs, the too-perfect placement of fallen logs, the slight discoloration of earth that meant a concealed firing position, the absence of insects in areas where they should be swarming. Tell Rodriguez to hold position. I want to call in some artillery before we move up. I keyed my radio handset. Fire mission, this is Charlie 26. Grid reference. The coordinates rolled off my tongue automatically. After 3 months of this, calling in fire support had become as natural as breathing. The response crackled back through the static. Charlie 26, this is Thunder Base. Shot over. 30 seconds later, the world exploded. The 105mm howitzer shells screamed overhead and detonated in a series of earth-shaking blasts that sent dirt and vegetation raining down on us. But even as the smoke cleared, I knew it wouldn't be enough. It never was. The Japanese had learned to dig deep, to build their bunkers with multiple layers of logs and earth that could withstand everything short of a direct hit. All right, boys, time to earn our pay, I called out, using hand signals to coordinate the advance. This was the part I hated most, exposing my men to enemy fire. But there was no other way. The Japanese weren't going to come out and fight us in the open. They were going to make us come to them, and they were going to make us bleed for every foot of ground. We moved in a modified wedge formation, with Private First Class Danny Chen on point. Chen was barely 20, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who'd volunteered for infantry duty when he could have gotten a cushy job as a translator. He had an uncanny ability to spot trouble before it spotted him, a sixth sense that had saved our lives more times than I could count. The first booby trap almost got him anyway. A simple device, a grenade with the pin pulled, held in place by a trip wire stretched across what looked like a natural animal path. Chen froze when he saw the wire, then carefully traced it back to its anchor point. "Pineapple special," he whispered, using our slang for the Japanese Type 97 hand grenade. Looks like they want us to take the scenic route. We backed off and found another way around, but it cost us precious time. Time was always the enemy in jungle warfare. Every minute we spent moving cautiously was another minute the Japanese had to prepare their next ambush, to call in their own artillery, to reinforce their positions. But rushing got you killed even faster. The Japanese had turned the art of concealment into a science. Their spider holes were barely large enough for one man, covered with carefully woven mats of vegetation that were invisible from more than a few feet away. A single soldier could lie in one of these holes for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to pop up and spray an entire American squad with rifle fire before disappearing again. We developed our own countermeasures, grenades rolled into suspicious-looking depressions, flamethrowers that could reach into the deepest holes, careful coordination between riflemen and bar gunners to provide covering fire. But the Japanese adapted too. They started building their holes deeper, with L-shaped tunnels that deflected grenade blasts. They connected multiple positions with underground passages, allowing soldiers to move from one firing position to another without exposing themselves. Some of their more elaborate bunkers had multiple levels, with lower chambers that could house a dozen men and upper firing positions that commanded perfect fields of fire. We reached the ridgeline just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the jungle canopy in shades of gold and crimson. Beautiful, if you could forget that men were dying in it. I could see Manila Bay in the distance, a shimmering expanse of blue that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Down there, MacArthur's staff officers were probably enjoying hot meals and clean sheets. Up here, we were living on K rations and hoping we'd live to see another dawn. "Sir, we've got movement in the tree line about 200 yards to our east," reported Corporal Mike Sullivan, our best marksman. Sullivan was a farm boy from Nebraska who could put a bullet through a dime at 300 yards. He'd been tracking a Japanese sniper for the better part of an hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the jungle canopy. I crawled over to where Sullivan had set up his position, a natural depression behind a cluster of bamboo stalks. Through his scope, I could just make out the faint outline off a camouflaged position. "How many?" I asked. "Hard to say, sir. At least 3, maybe more. They've got a Nambu machine gun set up, probably a Type 96. Good field of fire covering the approach to that next ridge." Sullivan's voice was calm, professional. He'd been doing this long enough to know that getting excited would only get you killed. The Type 96 was a nasty piece of work, a light machine gun that could put out 600 rounds per minute. In the hands of an experienced Japanese gunner, it could cut down an entire squad in seconds. We'd learned to respect those weapons, to plan our attacks around neutralizing them before they could open up on us. "Can you take him?" I asked. Sullivan nodded. "Give me 2 minutes to get a good angle. When I fire, you'll know I got him." He began to ease his way through the undergrowth, moving with the patience of a hunter who knew that one mistake would mean death. The Japanese sniper was good, but Sullivan was better. He'd been raised hunting deer in the Nebraska cornfields, and he'd learned patience the hard way. While Sullivan maneuvered for his shot, I deployed the rest of the platoon. Kowalski took half the squad to the left, where they could provide covering fire and prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their position. The other half stayed with me, ready to assault the enemy position once Sullivan had eliminated the machine gun. The crack of Sullivan's rifle was sharp and clear in the jungle air. Almost immediately, we heard the sound of shouting in Japanese, followed by the chatter of rifle fire. But the Nambu machine gun remained silent. Sullivan had done his job. "Go! Go! Go!" I shouted, and we charged up the slope. The Japanese had prepared for this moment, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew they were going to die. Rifle fire cracked from concealed positions, muzzle flashes winking like fireflies in the gathering darkness. I heard the distinctive whistle of mortar rounds incoming and dove for cover behind a fallen log. The explosions came in a series of sharp cracks, showering us with dirt and shredded vegetation. But we kept moving, bounds of 3 and 4 men at a time, each group covering the next as we closed the distance to the enemy positions. This was fire and movement at its most basic level, the fundamental tactic that had carried American infantry from Normandy to the Philippines. Private Rodriguez reached the first bunker and immediately came under fire from a second position he hadn't seen. The Japanese had learned to build mutually supporting positions, each one covering the other's blind spots. Rodriguez went down hard, clutching his shoulder and cursing in Spanish. Kowalski was there in seconds, dragging him to safety while laying down suppressing fire with his Thompson. I could see the muzzle flash from the second bunker, a well-concealed position built into the side of the ridge. The Japanese had piled logs and earth in front of it, creating a firing port that was almost impossible to spot until you were right on top of it. But they'd made one mistake. They'd built it too close to a stand of bamboo, and bamboo burns like gasoline when you put a flamethrower to it. Henderson, get that flamethrower up here, I called out. Private First Class Bobby Henderson was a skinny kid from Alabama who'd volunteered to carry the M2 flamethrower because it meant extra pay. He'd never imagined he'd be using it to burn human beings alive. But war had a way of changing your perspective on things. Henderson low-crawled to within 30 yards of the bunker, then rose to his knees and triggered his weapon. The stream of burning fuel arced through the air like a tongue of liquid fire, splashing against the bamboo and igniting it instantly. The screams that came from inside the bunker were barely human, but they stopped quickly. Fire was the one thing the Japanese feared more than death, and for good reason. By the time we'd cleared the ridge, full darkness had fallen. We'd killed at least 15 Japanese soldiers, maybe more. It was hard to tell in some cases. The flamethrower didn't leave much to count. But we'd paid a price for it. Rodriguez would live, but he was out of action for the foreseeable future. Private Collins had taken shrapnel in the leg from a mortar round, and we were all exhausted, running on adrenaline and caffeine tablets. I set up our defensive perimeter and called in our position to battalion headquarters. The radio crackled with reports from other units. Alpha Company had taken heavy casualties assaulting a fortified village. Bravo Company was pinned down by machine gun fire and couldn't advance. All along the front, American soldiers were dying to push the Japanese back one ridge at a time. "Sir, how many more ridges do you think there are?" asked Private Jimmy Walsh, a red-haired kid from Boston who'd been asking that same question for the past month. I looked out at the mountains stretching away into the darkness, peak after peak disappearing into the night sky. Somewhere out there, General Yamashita was planning his next move, deciding which ridges to defend and which to abandon. He had maybe 152,000 men left in northern Luzon, and every one of them was prepared to die rather than surrender. "I don't know, Walsh," I said finally, "but we'll take them one at a time, just like we always do." As I settled in for what I knew would be a sleepless night, I thought about the statistics the intelligence officers had briefed us on. The Japanese had lost over 40,000 men in the fighting around Manila alone. Their 14th Area Army was being ground down in a war of attrition they couldn't win. But they kept fighting anyway, trading their lives for time, for a few more days of resistance that might somehow change the outcome of the war. They wouldn't surrender. That much was clear. We were going to have to kill them all, every last one of them, if we wanted to secure Luzon. The thought should have bothered me more than it did. 6 months ago it would have. But war had a way of simplifying things, of reducing complex moral questions to simple matters of survival. They were trying to kill us. We were trying to kill them. Everything else was just details. The morning brought monsoon rains that turned the jungle floor into a sucking quagmire and made every step a potential disaster. Water poured through the canopy in sheets, turning streams into raging torrents and making visibility even worse than usual. But it also meant the Japanese couldn't see us any better than we could see them, and I'd learned to take advantage of every small tactical benefit the Philippines could offer. We'd been reinforced overnight, 2 fresh squads from Baker Company, along with a forward observer team that could call in naval gunfire from the destroyers lurking off the coast. The Navy boys were good, but they were also frustrated. Their big guns were designed to engage targets at sea, not to dig Japanese soldiers out of caves in the mountains. Still, a 5-inch shell could do wonders for morale, even if it didn't always hit what you were aiming at. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had visited our position just after dawn, slogging through the mud in his clean fatigues and trying to look like he belonged. He was a decent enough officer, but he'd spent too much time behind a desk and not enough time in the field. He talked about timetables and objectives, about the need to maintain our rate of advance to keep pace with the overall campaign. I nodded and agreed with everything he said, but we both knew the real situation. The Japanese were going to fight for every cave, every bunker, every spider hole. And they were going to make us pay in blood for every one of them. Intelligence estimates suggest the enemy has approximately 15,000 troops in this sector, Harrison said, consulting his map case. Most of them are from the 2nd Tank Division, reorganized as infantry after they lost their armor in the fighting around Clark Field. I almost laughed. 15,000. The intelligence weenies had been underestimating Japanese strength since the beginning of the campaign. Every time we thought we'd cleared a sector, more enemy soldiers would emerge from positions we'd never even suspected existed. The Japanese had been preparing these defenses for months, and they'd learned from their mistakes on other islands. They weren't going to waste men in Banzai Charges anymore. They were going to make us come to them, and they were going to bleed us white doing it. The attack jumped off at 0800 hours, 3 companies advancing abreast through terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. My platoon had the right flank, responsible for clearing a series of ridges that intelligence assured us were lightly defended. The first ridge was a nightmare of interlocking bunkers and concealed firing positions, each one invisible until you were close enough to see the muzzle flashes. We'd learned to read the jungle like a book by now. The way certain trees grew meant there was probably a bunker underneath them. An absence of vegetation in a particular pattern suggested a killing field, carefully cleared to provide the Japanese with perfect fields of fire. Even the birds could tell you things. They avoided areas where men had been digging, where the smell of death lingered in the humid air. Sergeant Kowalski had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot booby traps. He'd found 3 more tripwires before we'd advanced 50 yards, each one connected to a different type of explosive device. The Japanese were getting creative with their traps, using everything from modified artillery shells to improvised charges made from TNT and scrap metal. One particularly nasty device used a pressure plateau trigger, a bundle of grenades suspended from a tree branch. If you stepped on the wrong spot, you'd be shredded by fragments from above. They're learning, Kowalski observed as he carefully disarmed another trap. Getting smarter about placement, using our own tactics against us. He was right. The Japanese had been studying American infantry tactics, adapting their defensive strategies to counter our standard operating procedures. They knew we liked to use covering fire and movement, so they built their bunkers to channel us into killing fields where that tactic would get us slaughtered. They knew we relied heavily on artillery and air support, so they built their positions deeper and stronger with multiple layers of overhead protection. But we were learning too. We'd developed our own innovations, our own ways of dealing with an enemy that refused to fight fair. Bangalore torpedoes could blast through log and earth barriers that would stop conventional explosives. Flamethrowers could reach into the deepest bunkers, forcing the Japanese to choose between burning alive and coming out to fight in the open. And we'd learned to use the terrain against them to find the weak spots in their defensive schemes that even the most careful planning couldn't eliminate. The first Japanese opposition we encountered was a masterpiece of camouflage and engineering. Built into the side of a steep slope, it was completely invisible from the front and commanded a perfect view of the natural approach route. The firing port was no bigger than a dinner plate, but it was positioned to cover the only path through a particularly dense section of jungle. A single machine gunner could hold up an entire company there, and he probably would have if Private Chen hadn't spotted the position from an unexpected angle. "Sir, I can see the back of their bunker from up here," Chen called down from his position 20 feet up a mahogany tree. "Looks like they didn't expect anyone to climb up this far." I joined him in the tree, ignoring the branches that whipped across my face and the very real possibility that a Japanese sniper was drawing a bead on us at that very moment. From Chen's vantage point, I could see what he meant. The bunker had been designed to be impregnable from the front, but the rear entrance was protected by nothing more than a canvas tarp. It was a perfect target for a well-placed grenade. Getting into position took the better part of an hour. We had to circle around through terrain that was barely passable, crawling through mud that was sometimes knee-deep and dodging branches that could take your eye out if you weren't careful. But when we finally reached our objective, the assault was over in seconds. 2 grenades through the rear entrance, followed by a burst of submachine gunfire to make sure. The machine gun that had been holding up our entire advance was suddenly silent. Inside the bunker, we found the bodies of 3 Japanese soldiers. They'd been older men, probably in their 40s, with the weathered faces of career soldiers. One of them had been writing in a diary when he died, the brush still clutched in his hand. I couldn't read Japanese, but I could recognize the careful strokes of someone who'd been educated, who'd had a life beyond soldiering. It was easier when you could think of them as faceless enemies. The personal details made everything more complicated. The diary went into my field pack along with everything else that might be useful to intelligence. Maps, orders, personal letters, all of it potential sources of information about Japanese strength and intentions. The intelligence officers would pick through it later, looking for clues about enemy morale, supply situations, defensive plans. But I already knew the most important fact. These men had been prepared to die in their positions rather than retreat. That told me everything I needed to know about what we were facing. We pushed forward, ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker. The Japanese had prepared positions in depth, with primary defensive lines backed up by secondary positions and final protective lines. Even when we overran one position, there was always another one waiting for us further up the slope. It was like fighting a hydra, cut off one head, and two more would take its place. The casualties were mounting. Walsh took a bullet through the shoulder and had to be evacuated. Henderson's flamethrower ran out of fuel. Anth's replacement unit was defective, a manufacturing flaw that nearly got him killed when he tried to use it against a Japanese bunker. Private Morrison, no relation, despite sharing my last name, stepped on a mine and lost his left foot. The medics did what they could, but he was out of the war for good. By noon, we'd advanced maybe 300 yards and eliminated at least 20 Japanese positions. It didn't sound like much, but in jungle warfare, 300 yards was a significant gain. More importantly, we'd learned something about the enemy's defensive scheme. Their positions were elaborate and well concealed, but they weren't mutually supporting. Once you got behind one bunker, you could often take out 2 or 3 more before the Japanese realized what was happening. The intelligence estimate of 15,000 enemy troops in our sector was looking more accurate as the day wore on, but not in the way Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had intended. Instead of being spread out over a wide area, the Japanese seemed to be concentrated in specific strongpoints, with relatively empty areas in between. It was a classic defense in depth, designed to channel attacking forces into killing fields where they could be destroyed piecemeal. But it also meant that once you broke through the outer crust, you could sometimes advance rapidly through the softer areas behind. The trick was recognizing when you'd reached one of those areas and when you were walking into another trap. The Japanese were masters at making empty ground look defended and defended ground look empty. We got our first real break around 1400 hours when Sullivan spotted a Japanese command post in a natural cave about 100 yards ahead. The cave mouth was well concealed, but the Japanese had made the mistake of running a telephone wire from it to one of their forward positions. Sullivan had been tracking the wire for the better part of an hour, following it through the jungle like a bloodhound following a scent. "Sir, I can see at least 4 officers in there, maybe more," Sullivan reported through his binoculars. "Looks like they're planning something big." A command post was a tempting target, but it was also likely to be heavily defended. The Japanese had learned not to concentrate their leadership in obvious positions, but they still needed somewhere to coordinate their defensive efforts. A cave like this would be perfect, protected from artillery, invisible from the air, and easily defended against ground assault. I called in the coordinates to our forward observer, a young Navy ensign named Patterson who'd been with us for 3 days and was already talking like an old hand. Naval gunfire could penetrate even the deepest caves, and the psychological effect on the defenders would be enormous. But we'd have to be careful about the timing. One naval round falling short could wipe out half my platoon. "Fire mission, this is Blackbird Base," Patterson called into his radio. "Cave target, coordinates follow." The response came back almost immediately. The destroyer USS O'Brien was standing by, ready to provide fire support. Her 5-inch guns could put a shell through 20 feet of solid rock if they hit in the right spot. We pulled back to a safe distance and waited. The first shell arrived with a sound like a freight train, screaming overhead and detonating against the cliff face about 50 yards to the left of the cave mouth. The second shell was closer, sending up a geyser of rock and earth that showered the entire area with debris. The third shell was a direct hit. The explosion was tremendous, shaking the ground beneath our feet and bringing down trees 100 yards away. When the smoke cleared, the cave mouth had disappeared entirely, sealed by tons of shattered rock. If there had been anyone inside, they weren't coming out. But even as we celebrated this small victory, I knew it was just another drop in the bucket. The Japanese had hundreds of positions like this, one scattered throughout the mountains. Destroying one command post might disrupt their communications for a few hours, but they'd adapt and reorganize. They always did. The afternoon brought more of the same, methodical advances through prepared positions, careful coordination between riflemen and supporting weapons, the constant tension of knowing that every step might be your last. We'd developed our own rhythm by now, our own way of dealing with the stress and exhaustion of jungle warfare. You took it one position at a time, one ridge at a time. You didn't think about the big picture, about the thousands of Japanese soldiers still out there waiting for you. You focused on the next bunker, the next spider hole, the next booby trap. As the sun began to set, we'd advanced another 200 yards and eliminated maybe 30 more Japanese positions. The body count was getting harder to keep track of. Many of the positions were sealed by explosions or collapsed by artillery fire, making it impossible to confirm how many enemy soldiers had been inside. But the resistance was definitely weakening. Either we were wearing them down, or we were pushing through to the softer areas behind their main defensive lines. That night, as I tried to catch a few hours of sleep in a muddy foxhole, I thought about the numbers. In one day, my platoon had probably killed or wounded at least 50 Japanese soldiers. Multiply that by the dozens of platoons involved in the operation, and the casualties were staggering. The Japanese were being ground down in a war of attrition they couldn't possibly win. But they kept fighting anyway, selling their lives as dearly as possible. It was a kind of courage, I supposed. Misguided, fanatical, ultimately pointless, but courage nonetheless. They knew they were going to die, knew their cause was hopeless, but they kept fighting because surrender was literally unthinkable to them. In a strange way, I almost respected them for it. Almost. But respect didn't stop bullets, and it didn't make the war end any faster. Tomorrow we'd get up and do it all over again, advance through the jungle, clear the next ridge, count the bodies, and prepare for the next assault. Ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker, we were going to grind the Japanese army into dust. It was just a matter of time. The third week of March brought a change in the weather and a change in Japanese tactics that nearly got us all killed. The monsoon rains had stopped, leaving the jungle steaming in the tropical heat, and the Japanese had decided to abandon their defensive positions in favor of something much more dangerous, mobile warfare. It started with an attack on our supply lines. A Japanese patrol, maybe 20 men, had somehow infiltrated behind our positions and set up an ambush on the trail we used to bring up ammunition and rations. They hit a supply convoy just after dawn, killing 3 drivers and destroying 2 trucks loaded with 60mm mortar rounds. The explosions could be heard for miles, and the smoke column drew enemy artillery fire that lasted for 2 hours. I was pulling my men back to help secure the supply route when we stumbled into our own nightmare. The Japanese had set up a classic L-shaped ambush, with machine guns positioned to catch us in a crossfire that would have been devastating if Private Chen hadn't spotted the muzzle flash from the primary position a split second before they opened fire. Contact left. Contact left. Chen screamed, diving behind a fallen log as bullets chewed up the earth around him. The rest of the platoon reacted instinctively, spreading out and returning fire while looking for cover that was suddenly very hard to find. The Japanese had chosen their position well, an open area with limited concealment, surrounded by elevated firing positions that commanded perfect fields of fire. The machine gun fire was coming from at least 3 different positions, the distinctive chatter of Type 96 light machine guns mixing with the slower, heavier sound of a Type 92 heavy machine gun. The Japanese were putting out a tremendous volume of fire, more than I'd ever seen from a patrol-sized unit. Either they'd been reinforced or they were expending ammunition at an unsustainable rate in hopes of wiping us out quickly. Kowalski, take your squad left and try to flank that heavy gun, I shouted over the sound of gunfire. Sullivan! Can you see the gunners? Sullivan was already in position behind a termite mound, his rifle trained on the suspected location of the primary machine gun. Negative, sir. They're dug in good. Can't get a clear shot. The Japanese had learned from our tactics, adopting some of our own techniques for concealing firing positions. Their machine guns were protected by carefully constructed bunkers that provided excellent overhead cover while allowing the gunners to engage targets across a wide arc. Even worse, they'd positioned their weapons to provide mutual support. If we tried to assault one position, we'd be exposed to fire from the others. But they'd made one critical mistake. In their eagerness to create an effective killing field, they'd positioned themselves too close to a steep-sided ravine that ran parallel to their main line of defense. If we could get into that ravine, we could approach their positions from below and attack them from their blind side. "Henderson, get that flamethrower ready. We're going into the ravine," I called out. Henderson nodded and began checking his equipment, making sure the fuel connections were secure and the ignition system was functioning properly. The M2 flamethrower was a temperamental weapon, prone to malfunctions at the worst possible moments, but it was also the most effective tool we had for clearing bunkers at close range. Getting to the ravine meant crossing 30 yards of open ground under fire from at least 3 machine gun positions. It was the kind of maneuver that looked suicidal on paper but might just work if we could coordinate it properly. The key was timing. We'd need to suppress the enemy gunners long enough to make our move, then hit them hard and fast before they could reorient their defenses. "Chen, Walsh, covering fire on my mark," I shouted. "Everyone else, when I give the signal, we move for the ravine. Stay low and keep moving." The covering fire was intense but brief. We couldn't afford to waste ammunition on targets we couldn't see. But it was enough to make the Japanese gunners duck down behind their protective barriers, giving us the few seconds we needed to cross the killing field. I went first, sprinting across the open ground with my Thompson at the ready, expecting to feel the impact of machine gun bullets at any moment. The ravine was deeper than it had looked from a distance, maybe 8 feet deep and choked with vegetation that provided excellent concealment. But it was also a potential trap. If the Japanese realized where we were, they could pin us down with mortar fire or hand grenades. We had to move fast. Henderson was right behind me, followed by half the platoon. The other half stayed behind to provide covering fire and prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their positions. It was a calculated risk, splitting our force in the face of a numerically superior enemy, but it was the only way to break the deadlock. The ravine led directly to the rear of the Japanese positions, just as I'd hoped. From our new vantage point, I could see the carefully constructed bunkers that had been invisible from the front. The Japanese had built them into the natural contours of the hillside, using fallen trees and earth to create firing positions that were almost impossible to spot from more than a few yards away. But from behind, they were vulnerable. The rear entrance were protected by nothing more than canvas tarps, and the gunners were completely focused on the threat to their front. They had no idea we were less than 20 yards away, preparing to hit them with flame and high explosive. "Henderson, take the position on the left. I'll take the one on the right. Wait for my signal." I pulled the pins on 2 grenades and held them ready. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and the Japanese would have time to react. Too late, and Henderson would be exposed to fire from the positions that I hadn't neutralized yet. "Go," I shouted, and we attacked simultaneously. My grenades went through the rear entrance of the right-hand bunker, followed by a burst of submachine gun fire that silenced any survivors. Henderson's flamethrower sent a stream of burning fuel into the left-hand position, producing screams that were mercifully brief. The third position was the most heavily constructed, with multiple layers of logs and earth that had stopped our grenades from penetrating. But the Japanese inside were now completely cut off from their supporting positions, and they knew it. They tried to surrender, calling out in broken English, but it was too late for that. We'd learned not to trust Japanese surrenders. Too many booby traps, too many grenades held back for a final surprise. Kowalski finished them with his Thompson, firing through the firing port until the gun went silent. It was brutal, methodical, and absolutely necessary. In jungle warfare, you didn't take chances with enemy soldiers who might be playing dead or waiting for an opportunity to take you with them. The entire action had taken less than 10 minutes from start to finish, but it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, we counted 15 Japanese bodies, along with 3 machine guns and enough ammunition to supply a company. More importantly, We'd eliminated a threat that could have cut our supply lines and left us stranded in the mountains with no food, no ammunition, and no way to evacuate our wounded. But the Japanese weren't finished with us yet. As we were consolidating our position and preparing to move back to the main force, Sullivan spotted movement in the tree line about 400 yards away. A large group of Japanese soldiers was advancing toward our position, moving in a formation that suggested they were planning a coordinated assault. "Sir, I count at least 50 of them, maybe more," Sullivan reported through his binoculars. "They're spread out in a skirmish line, moving this way fast. 50 Japanese soldiers against the 18 men I had with me in the ravine." The odds weren't good, but we had several advantages: superior firepower, better positioning, and the element of surprise. The Japanese probably thought they were moving to reinforce the positions we'd just overrun. They had no idea those positions were now in American hands. I quickly deployed my men along the edge of the ravine, positioning them to create interlocking fields of fire that would catch the Japanese in a devastating crossfire. The M1 Garand rifles and Thompson submachine guns would provide rapid, accurate fire at short range, while our 2-bar Browning automatic riflemen could lay down suppressing fire to keep the Japanese from maneuvering effectively. "Wait until they're within 100 yards, I instructed. "Then hit them with everything we've got. Don't let them get close enough to use their grenades." The Japanese advanced with professional skill, using fire and movement tactics that would have done credit to any army. But they were advancing toward what they thought was a friendly position, and their guard was down. When we opened fire, the effect was devastating. The leading elements of the Japanese force went down in the first volley, cut down by rifle fire before they could even identify where the shots were coming from. The survivors tried to take cover and return fire, but they were caught in the open with no prepared positions to fall back to. It was a slaughter. Some of them tried to charge our positions, screaming the traditional battle cry that was supposed to terrorize their enemies. But we'd heard it all before, and we were ready for them.